Hi guys, here I'm going to show you a super simple Excel function that allows you to combine text from multiple cells into one cell and using a delimiter so you can have a space between the text or a dash, whatever you need. And we're not going to be using the concat or concatenate function or features in Excel because that's cumbersome and it's an old way to do it. If you're in a later version of Excel, Excel 365 or later, we get to use the TEXTJOIN function that I'll cover. But if you're in an earlier version, you don't have the TEXTJOIN function, we're going to create a function that mimics this one and it's going to allow you to do all the same stuff. So I've got all the bases covered here. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. Let's first start with the easiest thing. If you're in Excel 365 or later, you get to use the TEXTJOIN function. So let's use that to combine all of this text over here. Equals TEXTJOIN. I really hate the name of this function, but whatever. Delimiter, that's the first thing. So what do you want to use to separate the text? You do a quotation mark and then whatever you want for the delimiter. Let's make it a space here, then close the quotation mark, comma. The next one is, do you want to ignore empty cells? So if we select a bunch of different cells and some of them are empty, do you want the empty cells to factor in or not? Most of the time you're going to use true to ignore empty cells. So just type true here. Then the next selection, we could select multiple cells like this, although that's slow and cumbersome and annoying, just like the concatenate feature in Excel. So what we can do here is to select the entire range and then hit enter. This is my text. So it is so much easier than using the stupid concat feature. I can't believe it took Microsoft so long to do this. So you could use concat or concatenate, and then you select it and so on, but there's no delimiter, and that was always the pain in the butt. So you go like this, put a delimiter in there, and it just takes forever if you have a lot of different cells. So no more of this crap. In fact, let's get this out of here. I don't even want it as a reference. I hate it, have always hated it. So if you are in Excel 365 or 2019 or whatever the later versions are, use TEXTJOIN. Some people online say it should be available for Excel 2016. I think Excel might have even said that, but it seems like it's only for 365 and later. So TEXTJOIN. Now, let's move on to what are you guys going to do if you don't have Excel 365. Most people probably don't have the most recent version. No problem. We are going to create a user-defined function. And what we're going to do is we're going to mimic or mirror the TEXTJOIN function. So everything is going to be exactly the same. We'll have three arguments, a delimiter, an ignore empty argument, and select the cells. I'm going to call this something I think is a bit more logical, combine values. Now let's choose our delimiter. It is a space. And for the delimiters, they must be between quotation marks for either one of these functions. Next one, true to ignore the empty cells. And next one, select the cells. Bam! Now everyone who has an earlier version of Excel, a version earlier than 365, gets the lovely TEXTJOIN function. In a moment, I'm going to go over this function. I'm going to show you how it's created, how to put it into your workbook, and how to change this name if you do want to call it something else, although I think this is the best name for it. And then I'll show you how you can go about changing it, add a bunch of comments to it, and the usual for these tutorials that I do. But of course, if you want to skip all that, just download the workbook now, get the UDF, and don't watch anymore. So before I go to the UDF itself, to the VBA code, let's go down here. And I'll show you how it works. It works the same for both when we have dashes and empty cells. So let's use the TEXTJOIN delimiter. I do hate putting the delimiter first, but it makes sense when you can select multiple different cells at the end. So TEXTJOIN delimiter dash ignore empty. Let's do true. And then select the cells. Now let's go ahead and select an empty cell. Enter. Perfect. Now, let's do this, actually. What happens if we do not ignore the empty ones? If we change true to false? You see the dash at the very end right here. So the function tried to combine all of the selected cells, including the empty one. There's nothing here in the empty one. So it still included it, it's just empty. So it included an empty space, or nothing. So we still get the separator. That's why, by default, usually, you're going to want to leave the second argument as true. And this works for the function that we're going to create, or I'll show you how it was created, the combined values function that I made as well. Now let's go back to the function I made. Make sure this dude works just as well. All right, so it's annoying that you don't get those lovely argument hints. I do hate that, but let's choose our delimiter. Okay, true to ignore. Now we can go like this. Perfect. But I also want to show you how, let's go ahead and copy this guy, bring him down here, paste this in here, change true to false. At the end, you're going to have a bunch of examples in these columns here. Now, so false, let's go ahead and move it to D. Okay, you can see the extra cell there. Now let's say, this is another thing you can do. You don't just have to select one range, and this works for both functions. We could go ahead and add another cell there. We could type OK. Now let's select another cell, say this one. Okay, so we have a range, we have individually selected cells, and text that was put right in there. Hit enter. And you can see we have a doubled up dash right here. If we put a value in here, it'll pop in between that. Or, of course, we can go ahead and change false to true, and you're not going to get the doubled up dashes. So this is just to show you how you can use this, how versatile it is. You don't just have to select one range or multiple cells or just put text in like this. You can do a mixture of all of them. However, usually you'll probably just end up selecting a range. That'll probably be in 90% of the cases where you just select a range like this. But now that you know how to use it, now that you know all the different ways that you can input the data and combine the data, really quickly I do want to show you that for combining the values, just in case it's not clear, up here you could put nothing. And you would get nothing to separate the text. You would get no delimiters, no separator. So you've got a lot of flexibility. Now, for everyone who does not have Excel 365 or later, let's go ahead and show you how to install the UDF that allows you to create this function. UDF is just a user-defined function. And I will, as usual, go over the code. So to get this function in here, combine values, we have to go to the VBA window, Alt F11. Once you go here, if you've downloaded this workbook, open up the modules folder and double-click module 1. If it's not there, go to Insert Module, or if you have your own workbook, Insert Module, and then we can start to input the function there. So let's just start relatively quickly. How do you create a function? You go to the module, you start it with function, you give it the name of the function, you put in here a bunch of arguments for the function that I'll cover in a moment because we've got one interesting here, param array, that you might not have seen. So you put that in between the parentheses that are usually there, or that are there, not that are usually there. And then at the end, so this is where sub would go, where function is, and then at the very, very end, we put end function instead of end sub. So you have to put function there and function there to make it a usable function in the spreadsheet. The other thing you have to make sure that you do is whatever you name this function. So let's say you don't like the name I gave it, combine values. You want to give it another name. This name here must also be changed down here. This is how you output the value to the cell. Once you finish doing all of your processing, you come up with a value you want to spit out to the cell, and then you use the name of the function and set it equal to that value. That's how you get the value in the worksheet itself. Now let's go cover the arguments for the function. So our function, combine values, has 3 arguments. Let me go ahead and close this dude now. There we go. We have a delimiter argument, an ignore empty argument, and a text argument. Now these are the things that in a spreadsheet you have to input. You have to input a delimiter, you have to input this ignore empty thing, you have to input, well, what cells you want to combine. So in the previous tutorials and in most tutorials, I don't always declare the variables, and you technically, in most cases, do not have to. So you could see something like this. Instead of delimiter, just delimiter like that. But here we're going to go ahead and tell VBA what this should be. This should be a string. So we set this variable to a string. We do the same here. The ignore empty variable, we set it as boolean. Actually, I don't know how the hell you're supposed to say that word, but it means true or false. It's a very annoying word, and if you don't do programming, you might never see it. But just wherever you see this guy, just know that that means it should be true or false. And feel free to correct me on how to say that little bastard. Now the next argument is the text argument. Okay, this is a little bit different than a lot of UDFs and a lot of user-defined functions because here we want to allow the user to input multiple optional arguments. So it could be one range reference or 2 or 3 or 4 range references. So you select a range and then multiple different cells, or you select one cell, or you select 2 or 3 separate cells, or you input different text. So remember in our example down here, where we have many options. We've got a range, some cells, some hard-coded text, and so on. This right here is enabled via this right here. So you have the name of the variable, and we're going to turn that into an array. We turn it into an array by using the open and closing parentheses after it. No space there. No space. And before it, we have to put param array. Then afterwards, use as variant. So this setup right here is how you allow an optional number of arguments to go in. And it must be at the end of the function, at the end of the UDF. So that's why you put the delimiter first instead of this guy first. So this has to be at the end of the function, and you're going to put it like that. If you want to change the name for any of your examples, gosh, I hate editing code here. If you want to change the name, you just change text right here and then change it throughout the macro. So now we've got those 3 arguments. Okay. And I've declared some other variables here. Let's start with new array. New array is what's going to hold the final value that we want to output, or the almost final value. Let's put it that way. We have a variable I, which we're going to use to loop through the data and increase the size of our array, our new array. And then we have 2 dudes right here, and they're going to help us loop through what the user has selected, or the pieces of information the user wants to combine, be it a range, multiple different selected cells, or text. And to make life easier, I set element as a variant. That was to make life easier. Piece, however, should be a variant. Now, you're not going to know what these 2 dudes are for until we get into the code, so let's get into the code. First thing, I'm going to start commenting it now. Counter variable. So this is going to help us build the array. We're going to start it at 0. Maybe I should put that down here. This will help us build the array that will hold the output. Okay, cool. Now let us go down here. So the first thing that we want to do is to loop. I'm sure you guys all love loops by now. Okay, so here is our text value. This is what's going to hold all of the data that we want to combine. It is an array, and I haven't covered arrays here, but an array is simply an object or a thing that can hold many different things. So the text variable here is an array. It can hold many different range references or text references, whatever we put in for the 3rd argument of our function, and if we want a 4th or 5th or 6th argument. So the text function, the text variable holds all of those objects that we want to combine. Now we need to loop through those objects. One simple way to loop through objects, to loop through an array in VBA, is the for each loop. So you type for each, you come up with a name, whatever name you want. Here I called it piece. Then you type in, and then you type whatever you want to loop through. Well, we want to loop through the values that the user would like to combine, so we loop through text. Now piece Now piece, this variable here, is what we're going to use within the loop to reference every item within the text array variable. So name it whatever you want. We're going to use it inside the for loop. And this is set as a variant because it could be a range, or it could be text, or it could be many different things depending on what the user inputs for the final arguments of the combined values function. Now you don't need to worry about that if it's a variant or not thing. If you are confused, this is a side note, but maybe helpful. If you're confused about what to do up here for your variables, dim the name of your variable as, and then whatever, because you have many different options. If you're confused about that, just put variant. Variant makes life easy. You could put everything as variant as far as I know, and that way the code itself is going to figure out what it is. Now technically it's not the best coding practice, but if you guys need to get stuff done and you don't want to be confused, just put it as variant. Okay, so now let's go back to the loop. We are in the loop. We are looping through all the things in text, and we now need to combine them. We got a little bit of an issue here. So we have some objects which are range objects. Let's go back to this dude. This right here holds multiple different cells. Sounds kind of like an array, doesn't it? Something that holds multiple different things. This is going to hold one cell. This is going to hold one value. So our text array will hold all of these things right here. So it will hold 1, 2, 3, 4 different things. Now, do these things look the same to you? We've got a cell reference, text, and a range reference. They are not the same. And in fact, this range reference here is another array. Yes, that can be confusing. But what do you have to do when we have this array right here is basically all we're saying is here, A4 to D4, we have a group of cells. Let's break those cells out so we can get their value. Let's go back to the VBA window. Okay, so we go to the first argument, and we want to check if the first argument is a range or not, because if it is a range, we need to go inside that range to get the value from all the cells in it. So that's what this little dude does. We reference the first piece of the text array, and we do a simple if statement. If type name, then piece is range. So that tells us if it's a range. Check if the current value is a range or not. And then let's put a little tiny comment right here. If here, this piece is, in fact, a range. Now that's just a little helpful comment for you right there. Now that we know we've got a range, we need to go through it. So we use another for each loop. Follows the same pattern as the previous one. This is what we want to loop through. This is now a range because that's the piece of data within the text array. It's a range, so this is a range. We want to for each through the range. We want to use a variable called element. Remember, you can name it whatever you want. Just make it so it's easy to understand. So down here, we loop through the range. Now inside this loop, we use element to reference that. So now that we're inside the range, we need to do the magic. This is what is going to combine the values or prepare the values to be combined at the end of this macro. And the code that allows us to do that is this right here. I'll cover that in a moment. But you don't want to add the value to the array that will be output, the new array, all the time. So if the cell is empty, then you don't want to deal with it. So right here is where we check if the cell is empty or not. And I've got a couple of things here to explain. This is a simple if statement right here. Just a simple if statement. And what we've got in that is we've got the not. Don't get confused by not. All not does is reverse true to false and false to true. So ignore empty. This is an argument that must be passed here. You can see it up here. Ignore empty. It must be a true or false value, so we can use it directly within the if statement. So we want to check if ignore empty is true or false, but we want to flip it. So if ignore empty is true, we use not to flip it to false. And I'll explain how that works in this scenario in a moment. The or means to check another condition, just like in Excel when we have the and the or functions, very similar to that. We have another not here, and then we have a condition that will evaluate to true or false. Here we use the isEmpty function. So element is a range reference, because remember, piece references an entire range. So if we go back to here and use this example, piece is A4 to D4. And element cycles through. Element is first A4, then B4, then C4, then D4. So element is a range. We check if that is empty or not, which returns true or false, and then we reverse that true or false value using not. Now, this can end up being more confusing than you'd like it to be. But if statements just kind of end up that way sometimes when checking for conditions. So let me try and keep it as simple as possible, and let's go through it now. Let's say that for the ignore empty variable argument, you input false. You do not want to ignore any values. You want to combine all of them. Well, if I want to combine all of them, I put in false. This becomes false. So this right here is false. But then I reverse the false to a true using not. So that means that the false here became a true. And this is the first half of the if check in front of the or. This evaluates to true, which means we do everything down here. Now, let's say the user does want to ignore empty cells. So they do want to ignore the empty cells. So ignore empty is true. But we reverse the true with a not, so that becomes false, which means it would not do anything down here. But then we get to the second half of the if check, or the cell is not empty. So when we input a true for the ignore empty argument, now everything is reliant upon the second conditional check. So the second check goes, is this cell empty? If it is empty, this evaluates to true, which would cause this code to run. So we put the not in front of it. That makes the true turn to a false, so the code does not run. However, if this cell is not empty, this will return false. But we do want the code to run then, so the not turns the false into a true. All right, that can be confusing, I know. But I hope my explanation could help a little bit without driving you too crazy. So let's see here. Check if the user wants to ignore empty cells. Now, this is the meat of everything right here. And before I talk about it, I have to say that dealing with arrays in Microsoft Excel is horrible. Dealing with arrays in VBA, similarly, I do not like it. Okay, now that I've said that, let's go ahead and put the values that we would like to output into the new array variable. So we haven't done anything with that yet. We simply declared it up here, and I told you that I would be used to help put values inside the new array. Now also, it's important that you declare this array exactly like this. There are many different ways to declare arrays in VBA. Do it like this for this example. Okay. Now, down here. So one of the very annoying things in VBA is that you have to tell it how big the array will be. So here, we redim it. We basically redo this up here. Dim, redim, okay? Then we preserve it to keep the values that are already in it, if there are any, in it. Then we reference the array. Then we say how big we want it to be, and we are using I to figure that out. So I will be incremented right here, and it starts out as 0 because arrays can start at 0. And the first time it runs, it'll go ahead and put a 0 in here. The second time it runs everything, it'll put a 1 and a 2 and a 3. It'll do that because it gets incremented right down here. So now that we've got the size of the array, we can go ahead and fill the array with a value. So here's the array. We access its new highest value, which will be I in this example. And in there, we put the element. Now the element is a range reference. If you wanted to, you could put .value. So leaving it as element is the same as putting element.value in this example. That may be confusing, so I just wanted to cover that. But for this code, you're not going to see that guy. So this puts the value of the range inside our new array. Now we go ahead and we increment the value that we use to build our array. So the next time we need to put a value in it, we can put it at the next value. So first it goes in at I equals 0, then it goes in at 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now let me go ahead and put some comments here. Resize the array so that it can hold the new output value. Now here, add the current, let's say, ranges value to the array. Increment the value used to build the array. Okay. All right, now here's our end if to close this dude. So if the cell is empty, if we don't want to include it, none of this code runs. We don't increment anything, we don't deal with the array, we don't deal with any of this redim crap, none of it. This is our loop right here, which loops through our range. And then right outside the loop is what we have that checks if we're dealing with a range or not. So now we go down here, and we go all the way down here. So in our first example, the one we've been using, all of this stuff right here is what deals with A4 to D4. It's going to put all of those values into the new array variable. Okay, but let's back up a little bit. Let's go back up to the top for each loop, okay? Remember, we're looping through text, and text contains all of these dudes, and they aren't all ranges. So OK is certainly not a range. So we check if it's a range right here, and if it's a range, we do all the stuff I explained. But if it is not a range, we go down here. The value being, nope. Let's just go with this value is not a range. Since it's not a range, it means it's a single value, which makes our life so much easier. Look, all we have to do here is what I just explained, the meat of it. That's it. Check if the cell is empty or not, and pop it into the array. This right here is exactly the same as, where are you? This dude right here. So let's hit escape. Okay. Copy this comment right here. If not, ignore empty or not is empty piece, then. So here we check if the user wants to ignore the empty cells, but instead of element, we use piece. So up here, we were within a second for each loop. We were looping through piece using element. So we used element here. But this time we are only within the first for each loop. So we can directly reference piece. So we go down here. And we put piece in for here. Everything else here, that very long explanation I gave you for this, is true, holds true. So I'm not going to repeat it. Now down here, we do the same thing, redim preserve new array I. So let's go ahead, copy this note. Absolutely nothing changes with this. We resize the array so it can hold the new output value. Then down here, we add the current, let's just say value, because it doesn't have to be a range. So we add the current value to the array right here. And then down here, we go ahead and we increment the value used to build the array. So every time we put a value into the array, we are going to increment that value so that the next time, if we need to use it as we continue through the loop, we can use it. But if this is the very end of the loop and we no longer need to expand the array, it doesn't matter. I just gets incremented by 1 and never used again. So who cares? Nothing happens with it. And I think at this point we're getting to the end of the macro, the UDF. So here we just check if the user wants to ignore empties or not. We get the value, which will be directly in piece, and we pop it into our array that we will use to generate the output. Okay, close the if, close the if. That checks if this is for a range or not, because we looped through the ranges. This is the next for the very first for each. So remember, every for each has to have a next at the bottom to loop through it. So the next for this one, we can see here for each, and then next right here. So we get to the next, and then we get to the output. So remember, once we do all this, we have to output the data to Excel. And we do that by retyping the name of the function, the UDF, and then setting that equal to whatever we want to output. Now we have one more thing for me to explain. Join new array delimiter. So I bet you wondered what was going to happen with that delimiter. We haven't used it for the entire macro. Here is our delimiter. So we get that dude right up here, and we don't use it until the very last line. So it goes from the first line to the last line. Now, this is why we built an array to hold our values, because arrays, even though they are a pain to work with in VBA, are still awesome. So this array right here has a bunch of different elements in it. Let's say it has 5 different elements in it, or however many. And those are the values we want to combine. Well, basically, the function that we want to create in Microsoft Excel in the worksheet is this join function right here. So it's already available in VBA. This is what it looks like. Super easy, super awesome. Excel just decided to make it a little bit annoying and force us to go through this for way too many years before they added it in the spreadsheet. But anyway, so what the join does is it takes an array and it combines or it implodes all of those values in the array to put them together. And it uses the delimiter as the glue to combine them and put them together. So join is going to create our lovely text output string, combining all of the stuff in here using our delimiter. So we combine all that stuff right here, and then we just throw it inside the combine values. Throw it inside there, then it outputs it to the spreadsheet, and that's all there is to. So let's say combine the output values from our array using the join function or method, and output the result to the spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and add one more comment here. Loop through all of the values that we would like to combine. Okay, then maybe I'll go ahead and do this now, since this is my lovely macro. And of course you can get it on TeachExcel.com. So after all of this, we now have an awesome function to use in the spreadsheet. You do not have to do anything else, just put it in the module. Go down here and you've got your combine values function that you can use in pretty much any version of Excel. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.